She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't leak a single word to the tabloids or plant a story or make one public move that anyone could point to and say, "There, that's when it happened." Princess Anne simply walked into a working meeting, set a manila folder on the table in front of Prince William, stayed for 7 minutes, and left. And by the time William had finished reading what was inside that folder, everything he thought he understood about the last 4 years inside that palace had shifted underneath him like ground after rain. But here is the part that will stay with you. The part that nobody in that building had anticipated. The file Anne handed him wasn't hers. It had never been hers. It had been assembled from a correspondence archive that Camilla herself had requested access to 18 months earlier. Requested, been granted, used, and then, apparently, forgotten that the request itself had been logged. Forgotten that in this institution, nothing disappears. Nothing is ever truly private, and the paper trail is always longer than the person who made it. Hit subscribe before we go further into this, because the way it unravels is one of the most quietly brilliant pieces of institutional chess I have ever had the privilege of walking through. And the person at the center of it is one the public almost never thinks about, which is, as you will come to understand, entirely by design. Before we get into it, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. I am always genuinely amazed at how far this community reaches, and I want to know where you are sitting as this one unfolds. It was not a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gathering of the senior family in a gilded room, no moment that looked, from the outside, like anything other than the ordinary rhythm of palace business. Anne appeared at a working meeting, a routine review of charitable patronages under the umbrella of the Royal Foundation that had been scheduled weeks in advance. She placed a manila folder in front of William without explanation. She didn't sit down for the full meeting. She stayed for exactly 7 minutes, answered 2 questions about a separate equestrian charity she personally oversees, and then stood, nodded, and walked out. 7 minutes. The folder stayed behind. And William, by all accounts, didn't open it immediately. He set it to one side, continued through the agenda, moved through the remaining items with the discipline of someone who has been trained since childhood to finish what he started, regardless of what is waiting on the periphery. It wasn't until the meeting concluded, the room cleared, and the last advisor had shut the door behind them that he unclipped the folder and began to read. What he found inside took him the better part of an hour to work through. And when he was finished, he sat in that empty room alone for another 20 minutes before he called anyone. That detail, that silence, that is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it tells you more than any description of the documents themselves ever could. When a man who has been trained from birth to absorb difficult information and move immediately to decision sits alone in silence for 20 minutes, you are not reading shock in the ordinary sense. You are reading the slow, deliberate recalibration of a person who has just understood that a problem he believed was manageable is significantly older, and significantly deeper, and significantly more thoroughly documented than he had ever been allowed to see. He wasn't collecting himself. He was rebuilding his map of the last 4 years from scratch. Now, to understand what was in that folder, you need to understand what Camilla had been building. Not in the tabloid version of this story, where a scheming woman moves pieces across a board in some gothic drama of palace ambition. The real version, which is, I find, almost always more interesting than the tabloid one, and considerably more honest. Because what Camilla had been doing wasn't scheming, exactly. It was consolidating. And the distinction matters enormously, because consolidation is what every competent operator inside a large institution does when a transition creates space. The question was whether this particular consolidation had stayed within the boundaries of what had been formally authorized. When Charles became king, Camilla's formal role expanded in ways that were partly ceremonial and partly structural. She acquired patronages through proper channels. She assumed a public-facing function at an increasing number of state occasions. And she began, in the administrative reorganization of a new reign, quietly requesting access to various correspondence archives inside the palace. Access that, in the grief and controlled chaos of a monarchy navigating its first transition in 70 years, was largely granted without the level of scrutiny such requests would ordinarily have received. And that is the first thread William pulled when he finished reading. Because the correspondence archives Camilla had requested access to were not general archives. They were specific ones. They included files relating to patronage assignments across the 4 decades of the late Queen's reign. Files that documented which charities had been formally aligned with which members of the royal family, and on what basis, and through what authorization process. Files that recorded, in the dry, careful language of institutional bureaucracy, the precise legal and procedural logic that governed how a senior royal's public role was structured and bounded. Now, taken in isolation, you could read that charitably. A new queen consort learning the machinery of an institution she had been adjacent to for years, trying to understand how things worked from the inside, now that she finally had legitimate access. Entirely reasonable. Expected, even. The problem, and this is the problem William found documented inside the folder Anne had left him, is that the access hadn't just been used for orientation. It had been used for research. Specific, targeted, cross-referenced research, with a pattern to it that, once you could see it, was impossible to explain as anything other than deliberate. Anne had found the pattern because Anne does what Anne always does. She reads the paper, all of it, every line of it, without drama and without anyone watching. People forget this about Princess Anne. Or rather, they never quite learn it in the first place, because Anne makes herself easy to forget in a very particular way. She operates without the gravitational pull of public attention that follows William or Charles, or, in a different register, Harry. She gives almost nothing to the press. She maintains a kind of deliberate opacity around her working life that has been consistent for 5 decades. She appears at engagements with the efficiency and self-possession of someone who has never once confused the job with the performance of the job. She shows up, she does the work, she leaves. And because she generates so little noise, people eventually stop watching. Which is, I have come to understand, exactly how she prefers it. Because while nobody was watching, Anne had been doing something methodical and patient and extraordinarily precise. She had been tracking what was changing around her, not obsessively, not with paranoia, with the calm, consistent attention of someone who has been inside the same institution long enough to know exactly what normal looks like, and therefore to notice immediately when something isn't. She sits on a number of internal advisory panels. She has been doing so for decades, and over the course of the 2 years since Charles's accession, she had noticed something. Patronages were shifting. Not dramatically, not in ways that generated coverage or triggered any formal notification. Incrementally, the way a tide moves, which is to say constantly and quietly and only obviously in retrospect. A charity here that had been under one member's umbrella for years, quietly reassigned. A working group there whose chair had changed without formal announcement. And then, in 3 separate instances, organizations that had operated under the late Queen's direct patronage and then under the transitional arrangements of the new reign received correspondence on palace letterhead through official channels suggesting that future liaison should be directed to the Queen Consort's office. 1 or 2 of those, Anne had allowed herself to explain away as administrative tidying. A new reign generates an enormous volume of administrative tidying. People and roles and portfolios need to be reassigned and redrawn, and the process is never perfectly linear. She had given it reasonable doubt, as she would give anything reasonable doubt until the evidence for doubt ran out. And then she found the 4th instance, and the 4th one came with documentation. Because the 4th organization was one Anne herself had co-founded. A small, unglamorous charity. The kind that generates no coverage and attracts no celebrity attention, and would never appear in a magazine spread or a social media campaign. Focused entirely on supporting rural communities in agricultural decline. Communities that have been quietly losing ground for decades in ways that don't photograph dramatically enough to sustain public attention. It had operated for 11 years under a shared patronage arrangement that Anne had personally negotiated and that had been formally documented across multiple correspondence files in the late Queen's archive. And it had received a letter. 3 weeks before that working meeting, suggesting, in the polished, careful language of palace communication, that going forward, it would sit within the Queen Consort's portfolio. Nobody had asked Anne. Nobody had informed Anne. The letter had been sent, on official stationery, using institutional language that implied the full backing of the palace administration, and Anne had found out about it because one of the charity's trustees, confused, uncertain whether the communication was an instruction or a suggestion, unsure what protocol required of them, had phoned her directly to ask what they should do. That was the moment Anne stopped giving reasonable doubt to anything. She spent 6 weeks pulling the thread, quietly, systematically, in the way she approaches everything that matters to her, without telling anyone what she was doing or why, without consulting anyone for input or validation, without leaking or posturing or building any kind of coalition around what she was finding. She went to the archive. She read the access logs. And she built the case alone, from the primary documentation until she was certain, not probably right, not mostly right, but absolutely and documentably certain about what had happened. And here is where this stops being a patronage dispute and becomes something closer to a surgical operation. Because what Anne found in the archive, working through the access logs with the patience of someone who finds no document too dry and no detail too small to matter, is that the correspondence files Camilla had been granted access to had been used with a specificity that went well beyond general orientation. The access logs in a correspondence archive record every document requested and every cross-reference made. This is not surveillance. It is standard archival practice, the same way a library records which volumes have been checked out and when. It means that if you go back through the records, you can reconstruct exactly what a person was looking at, what they were comparing it against, and in what sequence they were working. And what the logs from Camilla's authorized access showed, when laid out in sequence, was a pattern of research that was specific and targeted and sophisticated enough and consistent enough across multiple sessions over several months that it could not have been accidental or general. Someone, and Anne was careful in the documentation she assembled to use the passive construction, someone working from the authorized access rather than naming Camilla directly, which tells you everything about how precisely she understood what she was building and what it needed to withstand, had methodically mapped the 17 patronages that existed in what you might call the institutional gray zone. The ones that had been personally the late queen's in a way that didn't automatically transfer to a specific role in the new reign. The ones that required active claiming through a formal assignment process rather than simply carrying forward. The ones that, in the disruption and volume of a transition, might go unclaimed long enough for a reallocation to go unnoticed. Those 17 had been cross-referenced against the public engagement calendars of working royals to identify which were being actively maintained and which had, in the controlled chaos of a new reign, quietly lapsed in their formal attachment. And then, in 3 cases initially, and a 4th before Anne caught it, the gaps had been moved into. Not stolen. That word is too loud and too simple for what the documentation showed. Absorbed, quietly, institutionally, using the architecture of a working monarchy in transition, in ways that would look, from any external vantage point, entirely like normal administrative rationalization. Letters on real stationery. Language implying real authorization. Moves that were close enough to the process that most recipients would not have known to question them. That is what William read, alone in the empty meeting room, for an hour and then 20 minutes of silence after. Not a smoking gun. Something quieter and considerably more unsettling than a smoking gun. A map of the institution's soft spots, drawn by someone who had been given legitimate access to the archive and had clearly understood exactly what that access was worth. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters when the subject is this complicated. This was not theft. These were not criminal acts. In the landscape of what powerful families do to each other inside institutions, what the documentation showed was sophisticated and methodical and operating entirely within the formal mechanisms of how the palace functions. The letters were real. The authority they appeared to carry was real authority, or sufficiently close to it that most recipients would not have questioned it. None of this happened outside the system. It happened through the system. And that is actually what made it so difficult to address once it was found. What it was, and this is what the file made undeniable, which is why Anne built it as carefully as she did, was a use of institutional access for institutional expansion that had not been authorized at the level the institution's own governance required. Charles, as king, had the authority to reassign patronages through the proper process. Camilla did not unilaterally, not by using archive access as the basis for identifying targets and then routing letters through her office in ways that implied palace-wide approval for changes that had never been formally sanctioned. The process had been bypassed. And in a family where process is not bureaucratic inconvenience, but the actual substance of legitimacy, bypassing process is not a small thing. It is, in the quiet language this family speaks, a very large thing indeed. William understood that, sitting in the empty room. And I think what the 20 minutes of silence was really about is this. If the pattern had been running for nearly 2 years, across 4 organizations, using a research methodology that clearly predated any single opportunistic letter, then the question was not simply what to do about 4 patronages. The question was how far back the map went, how many other gray zones had been identified, how many other moves might have been made that had not yet surfaced because nobody had yet looked for them. That is a different problem from what he had walked into the meeting expecting to deal with. A considerably larger and more serious one. And that is where Princess Anne's 7 minutes becomes something I find genuinely extraordinary. Because she had understood that before William did. She had done all of the work, over 6 weeks, alone. She had assembled the documentation to a standard that would hold up under scrutiny. And then she had made a choice about where to take it that I think is the most revealing decision in the entire story. She didn't take it to Charles. Think about that. Charles is the king. He is Camilla's husband. He is, in the formal hierarchy of the institution, the person to whom something of this nature should be escalated. The obvious move, the institutional move, is to go to the king. Anne didn't make it. And if you sit with why, the answer comes into focus, and it is not comfortable for Charles. Charles made Camilla queen consort. Charles had spent decades advocating for her rehabilitation, absorbing enormous public hostility on her behalf, and engineering the slow, careful reconstruction of her public image across a period when that image was genuinely in ruins. Charles had been the driving force behind the expansion of her formal role in the new reign. He had opened the doors. If the documentation now showed that the expansion of her role had, in some of its specific operations, moved outside formally authorized boundaries, then bringing the documentation to Charles means putting Charles in the position of choosing between his wife and the institutional integrity of his own reign. Anne did not want to hand him that choice. Or, and I think this reading is more honest even if it is less generous, she understood that handing him that choice meant giving him the option of making the problem disappear in a way that served his marriage rather than in a way that served the institution. Charles is not a person who operates without sentiment, especially where Camilla is concerned. Anne is not a person who trusts sentiment to produce correct institutional outcomes. So she gave the folder to William, the heir, the next king, the man who will carry the weight of everything being built and dismantled in this reign. The man who had no personal stake in Camilla's expansion, and therefore no internal pressure to minimize what the documentation showed. The man who could look at the map and ask the only question that actually mattered from an institutional standpoint. How do we fix this, and how do we make sure the architecture prevents it from happening again? Anne identified the right person for the problem she had found. She handed it to him, and she left before the conversation started, because the conversation was not something she had any interest in being part of. Her part was finished. She had done the work that needed doing. What happened in the days following is where the story becomes in some ways more complex, and in others almost clean. William did not go to Camilla directly. He did not go to Charles immediately either. He did what he tends to do when he is working through something of this scale. He took it to a small number of trusted advisors, legal and institutional rather than personal, and asked them to independently assess what the documentation showed and what the correct procedural response was. He asked for the assessment in writing. He gave them 72 hours. Their written assessment came back precise and unambiguous on the central question. 3 of the 4 patronage reassignments had been carried out without the required level of formal authorization. The 4th occupied genuinely ambiguous territory where arguments existed on both sides, though the stronger argument pointed the same direction as the other 3. The procedural remedy was straightforward: a formal internal review. The 3 clearly unauthorized reassignments returned to their previous status while the review proceeded, and a properly authorized reassignment process established for going forward. Standard, bloodless. The kind of administrative correction that happens inside large institutions constantly and generates no external noise. What was not straightforward, and what took considerably more deliberation, was the question of the archive access itself. Because the access had been legitimately granted, Camilla had not circumvented anything to get into the archive. She had been given the keys through proper channels, and what the logs showed her doing with those keys was, technically, within the scope of what access of that kind permits. The question of whether the research had then been applied in ways that exceeded her authorized role was a separate and murkier question. And murky questions inside a monarchy tend to be resolved through precedent and process rather than direct accusation, because direct accusation requires a standard of proof that is difficult to establish and generates exactly the kind of public friction that the institution is built to avoid. What William chose to do, and I think this is the decision that will be studied for a long time by anyone who pays close attention to how power moves in this family, is that he separated the 2 problems entirely and addressed each one on its own terms. The patronages were addressed procedurally. The review was initiated, the reassignments were paused, and the process for formally authorizing future changes was restructured in ways that required multi-level sign-off across different parts of the palace administration before any reallocation could go forward. No announcement, no statement. The machinery was simply adjusted so that the door that had been left open was now closed and bolted through the architecture of the process itself. Anyone trying to make the same moves going forward would find the structure itself blocking the path, without any individual ever having to say no to any specific request. The archive access question was handled with equal precision and considerably more elegance. William did not revoke Camilla's access. He did something more considered. He requested that a formal log review protocol be established across the archive access arrangements for all senior royals, framed not as a response to any specific concern or any specific person, but as a standard governance improvement appropriate to a new reign establishing its working practices. Universal application, neutral language, impossible to object to without appearing to object to oversight itself. The protocol wasn't aimed at Camilla, it was aimed at everyone equally, which meant it could not be read as an attack on anyone specifically, which meant there was no surface against which to push back. That is the architecture of William's response, and I want you to appreciate what it actually did. It fixed the problem. It closed the avenue that had been used. It created accountability structures that would catch any recurrence before it developed into a pattern. And it did all of this without a confrontation, without an accusation, without anything that required Charles to be placed in the impossible position Anne had been wise enough to spare him from. Everything that needed to happen, happened, through process, invisibly, in the way that the most consequential things inside this family always happen. Now I want to talk about the human reality underneath all of the institutional language, because it is easy to get lost in the mechanics and forget that there are people living inside them. Camilla spent decades on the outside of a family that did not want her, in the view of the press and a significant portion of the public, enduring a sustained level of hostility that would have genuinely broken most people. And she came through it, with composure, with patience, with a kind of quiet endurance that I think even people who disliked her would have to respect if they were honest. When the doors finally opened, when Charles became king and her position was formalized, and the long campaign of rehabilitation reached its formal conclusion, something shifted in the way she operated. Not maliciously, I think, but with the urgency of someone who had waited a very long time and was now moving perhaps faster than the institution's formal processes were built to accommodate. She was given access to the archive. She used it. She saw a landscape of unclaimed territory, and she began, incrementally, to move into it. And nobody told her no. Nobody flagged the pattern. Nobody ran the access logs and compared them to the sequence of letters being sent from her office. Until Anne did. Until Anne spent 6 weeks in the archive and built the case alone and put it in a folder and left it on a table for the right person to find. And the tragedy in this, and there is a real tragedy, not a melodramatic one but a quiet one, is that the same drive that produced the archive research was probably rooted in something genuine, the desire to actually do the role, to hold the position of queen consort with real substance rather than pure ceremony, to be useful in an institution that has no shortage of people who are decorative and a perennial scarcity of people willing to do the unglamorous work of learning the machinery from the inside. That is not a bad impulse. The problem was not the impulse, the problem was the path. And Charles, in all of it, is the figure who carries the most complicated weight, even though he never appears on camera in this story. Because if the documentation is accurate, and the 72-hour review found nothing to suggest it wasn't, then the expansion of Camilla's access and role that Charles had championed and enabled had created the precise conditions through which this could happen. Not because Charles designed it that way, not because he knew, but because the doors he opened out of love and out of a desire to validate the woman he had fought so hard and so publicly to be with were the doors through which the pattern developed. He did not authorize what the logs showed. He may never have known about it at any specific level, but his authority was the architecture through which it moved. And his name is on the letterhead of the institution whose processes were bypassed. And now his son has quietly, cleanly, without a single confrontation and without asking permission, fixed the architecture in a way that closes every door that was left open, not with anger, with process, with the cold, precise application of institutional procedure that is, in this family, the most devastating form of power there is. Let me come back to Anne, because she is the person this story is really about, even though she will appear in no headline and no summary will center her in the way the evidence suggests she deserves. After the protocol review was announced internally, framed as standard governance, universal in application, nobody's name attached, Anne was approached and asked whether she would be willing to contribute to the working group designing the new archive access framework. Given that she had been inside the institution longer than almost anyone currently working within it, and had seen multiple previous governance arrangements from the inside, her input was considered valuable. She agreed to participate. She attended 3 working sessions. She made 4 specific recommendations, each of them precise, each of them drawn from decades of watching what worked and what left gaps. All 4 were adopted into the final framework without modification. And then, when the framework was finalized and the working group's mandate concluded, she was offered the chair of the ongoing oversight panel, the formal, titled, publicly acknowledged chair. She declined. She gave what she had. She built what needed building. She stepped back before anyone could thank her publicly or attach her name to what she had built in any way that would require her to defend it or explain it or stand in front of it as its visible custodian. She declined the credit. She walked out of the frame. You can read that as modesty, and perhaps some of it is modesty in the ordinary sense. But I think it is primarily strategy. And I think it is the same strategy she has been running, consistently and without interruption, for 50 years. Because the person who chairs the oversight panel is visible. The person who built the architecture that made the oversight panel necessary and then quietly stepped back before the world fully understood what had been built is not visible. And not visible, in this family, is not weakness. Not visible is protection. The people who are seen are the people who can be targeted. Anne has spent half a century making herself very difficult to target. She understands something about power that very few people in her position have ever fully grasped. That it is most durable when it is not attached to a title, or a chair, or a public position that can be stripped away, or challenged, or undermined. When it lives in the quality of your judgment, and the accuracy of your reads, and the patience to wait until you are certain before you move, and the discipline to walk away once the work is finished. She has never chased the story. She has always, quietly, built the architecture that the story eventually runs into. And so, when this is all eventually written up in whatever form historians and archivists eventually get hold of, the headline will say something about William's decision, or the restructuring of Camilla's role, or the tension in the family, or some version of all three. And the truth underneath the headline, the woman who spent 6 weeks alone in the archive, built the case without telling anyone, identified the correct recipient for it, handed it across a table in 7 minutes, and left before the folder was even opened, will be, at best, a sentence in a footnote, which is exactly where she would want it to be. Let me leave you with the question I keep turning over long after the research is finished. Who actually did the work that mattered most in this story? Was it William, who read the map and moved with precision to fix the architecture without confrontation? Was it the institution itself, a monarchy so layered with logged correspondence and documented process and accumulated procedural memory that it ultimately corrects for the people inside it, even when those people don't know they are being corrected? Or was it a woman who showed up for 7 minutes, left a folder on a table without explanation, and was already in her car before the person she left it with had reached the 3rd page? Because here is what I keep coming back to. A patronage can be reassigned. A governance framework, once embedded properly in the institutional architecture, takes a generation to undo. Anne knows the difference between things that last and things that don't. She has always known it. She built the thing that lasts. And she did it without a title, without a headline, and without ever once needing anyone to know it was her. The folder was the weapon. The 7 minutes was the delivery. Everything else was just the room it went off in. And the woman who set it down and walked out before the explosion, she was already somewhere else entirely, doing the next unglamorous necessary thing, in complete silence, with nobody watching. Subscribe so you're here when the next folder surfaces. And tell me in the comments, who do you think actually won this one? Because with this family, the answer is never who the headline suggests. I'll see you in the next one.